Thank you, Jag, and welcome everyone. My name is Karandeep Singh. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Learning Health Sciences here at the medical school. I'm also a member of the MIDAS program committee, and on behalf of the program committee, we are delighted today to have Dr. Suzanne Bakken with us here in Ann Arbor for the very first time. Dr. Bakken completed her bachelor's in science in nursing at Arizona State University. She completed her master's of science and PhD in nursing studies at the University of California, San Francisco, after which she did her postdoctoral training in biomedical informatics at Stanford University. She's the alumni professor of the School of Nursing and professor of biomedical informatics at Columbia University, where she also has numerous administrative roles and has directed multiple centers. She also currently serves as the editor-in-chief of JAMIA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, the premier journal in medical informatics for the past few decades. A lot of the work that we talk about when we think of scholarly work, we think of the purpose as being generating knowledge. But knowledge doesn't always have an impact until it's disseminated, until it's implemented. And so we're excited today to have Dr. Bakken give us an editor's perspective on this process of advancing discovery and application of health data in the process of doing work that actually matters. We will have some time for questions at the end, so please ask questions, but please save them till the end of our talk. So with that, welcome.
Thanks. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I'm really humbled to be here as well, to be coming to such an interdisciplinary group and also to such a data science powerhouse.
Let me see if it's the right deck. Can you different deck? If you need to...
Oh, we need to get my presentation.
Sorry. Give us a moment.
Yeah, thanks.
What did people tell you?
Anyway, it was scary enough. I tried to say no several times because I couldn't quite envision what I might have to offer you that you wouldn't already know. So that's why I'm calling it my perspectives in particular.
Okay, so let's see a slideshow.
Okay, and you have the clicker. Thanks. Now we're good to go.
I'm just seeing if I can get the stuff out of the way, but... Okay, that's okay.
I think it's fine. Yeah, and so what I'd like, so thanks so much to the MIDAS leadership and the Symposium Planning Committee for inviting me, and it is my great opportunity to share some thoughts from my perspective as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association. I'll be spending some time, what probably most computational scientists don't necessarily do, and spend some time doing what qualitative researchers would call bracketing, really talking about a little bit about me and where my perspectives come from, so it's clear why I may say some of the things that I do. So I'll start off with a little bit more about me, talk about the history of biomedical and health data science in JAMIA, and then give a few remarks on key considerations. I'd like to just acknowledge University of Michigan on the JAMIA editorial team. I do realize that Julia Adler-Milstein, who's one of the associate editors, is now at UCSF. Tiffany Vano has played a key role in the journal, serving as a guest editor and also editorial board member, and then also Marissa Conte, Alan Flynn, and B.G. Vinod Vaidiswaran as members of the editorial board. I want to talk a little bit about my 28-year history with JAMIA. On the left are on the top left is the first paper I ever published in JAMIA, and it was in the first issue, Volume 1, Issue 1. And it really was something talking about the language of nursing. And so that was the beginning. Through a decade, I published lots of other types of papers in JAMIA and elsewhere, really focused on different types of health data standards for interoperability in particular. The things on the right represent my more current work, which looks quite different. Through the years at JMIA, I started out as an author, then as a reviewer, an editorial board member, became an associate editor-in-chief editor, and then in 2019, I became the editor-in-chief. And the point that I'll make about that is I am the first non-physician editor-in-chief, and I'll say that meant something to the broader biomedical and health informatics community, because in having me chosen as the editor-in-chief, there was certainly an expectation that I might broaden what was published in the journal, and I hope that I've been successful in doing that. In addition to the perspective I bring, it's 28 years with JMIA, I point out I'm also bringing my perspective of health data science, which is informed by, I can't believe it, but 48 years as a registered nurse. So what I show in this slide is my first, no, not because I'm not there. Okay. What I show on this slide is the first paper that had anything to do with data science that I published in journal. And this is co-authored with Patty Brennan, who's now the director of the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health, and also a nurse and also an engineer. And in this, the deans of nursing basically were begging us to write this kind of paper to give some guidance to schools of nursing. And basically, we made an argument that nursing really needs big data and data science to be able to really take advantage of new data sources to complement our traditional data sources and understanding of particular phenomenon of interest. And also, increasingly important, so much of research takes place in silos, and often it doesn't take into account the context of an individual's daily lives. And certainly new data sources provide us with the opportunity. We felt that new types of distributed networks would be really important to advance nursing science. And we also thought about new opportunities for theory development. And typically with nurse scientists, if you're going to do a study, you often think about your theory and you go from the theory to the data, et cetera, to your analytics. But we really felt with the opportunities with data science really provided new opportunities for theory development in really starting with the data and then being able to infer some theoretical propositions from that. But we also argued that that the nursing perspective would be relevant to data science more broadly. And one of the things about nursing is that we have a social contract with the public in our, and so we really consider it a social obligation to apply our expertise in multiple areas, and that would include data science. Nursing typically brings extensive experience working with populations who are high risk for health disparities, really can provide insights about things such as the completeness of data, and very often brings a very holistic rather than a reductionist approach. So we can offer definition and context to data elements, expertise in the use of theories. And one of the things that I'll come back to a little later, and I think many in nursing practice spend a lot of time on communicating with patients and families in particular. And so many of the interventions focus on really assisting patients and their families to interpret and act upon a variety of types of healthcare data that they receive. And I tell you, one of the most common things a gazillion years ago when I was still a nurse in the critical care unit, after rounds, the family would say two things to me: what did they say, what does it mean, and what would you do? And so thinking of how important that providing interpretations of the health data is incredibly important. And I think this is something that I'd like to see more from the community, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Another, almost done with the bracketing, the last bracketing slide, I think. But the most recent opportunity to really reflect on my practice discipline of nursing rather than my scientific discipline of biomedical informatics, I was asked to take an informatics and data science perspective on a National Academies report, which is on the future of nursing 2020 to 2030. And this report is, one of the basic contentions is that nursing is important to health equity. They have skills that could offer interventions related to social determinants of health. If you put more nurses in the community with the right sets of skills and the right tools, equity will improve. And although there was one specific recommendation in the report, which you see in the top bullet on the slides, which says that, yes, nurses should be involved in designing, generating, analyzing, and applying data, but they should be using diverse platforms, AI, and other innovative technologies. That was really and of course there would be the required competencies to be able to do that. But what I argued along with my former postdoc, Caitlin Dreisbach, who is a nurse with a PhD in nursing, but a Master of Science in data science from University of Virginia, and then a postdoc in data science from Columbia University. So we brought our perspectives from our postdoctoral training, and we basically argued, even though the report says there's only one kind of data or technology related recommendation, we basically argued with what they were trying to do, every single recommendation was based on data that needed to be collected, organized, analyzed, visualized to really make the recommendations of the report move forward. So the other perspective I bring, since in this talk I'm coming from the perspective of really as an editor-in-chief, is throughout my career I've believed in the power of dissemination and that it was key to transparency and impact of science in general, and particularly thinking about it today in terms of health data science. And so much of what I focus on as an editor-in-chief is, of course, the manuscripts. But we have many other things that need to be disseminated, including the data sets, the codes, the protocols. And I also think about it from my perspective as someone who works in health communication, really thinking about dissemination of tailored communication to not beyond what we do in scientific manuscripts, thinking about what does our work mean for clinicians, what does it mean for the research participants that may be the data generators. Importantly, what can we learn that we should be packaging for the policymaker? And then thinking about the different places and how we might disseminate these different artifacts. One of the things that we're talking about at dinner last night was when we think about these different artifacts and the different ways of disseminating them, yet in many of our academic processes, we still only get credit for the manuscript and not for any of the work in these other things, such as making your data set available for use by others. I now want to turn my attention to, I thought I was done bracketing, but I'm going to bracket one more thing. And that is, I just point to where I am personally in my program of research is really on that communication to community members and to research participants. And we do this through the development of culturally congruent health literate communication. And this is an example of two grants that we have currently for the rapid acceleration of diagnostics for underserved populations, which is a RADx up, which is a big NIH COVID initiative. So we've been creating these things for about a decade. So we're taking what we've learned through the years, using community engaged participatory design to create infographics, and then really packaging it into the toolbox that instead of being used by us would be used by community-based organizations, so we can really put a high-tech tool in the hand of trusted high-touch workers who have been at the forefront of the pandemic in many of our communities. And I'm happy to talk to people about that separately, but today I'm wearing not my researcher's hat, but my editor's hat. It was very useful. This invitation was particularly useful to have me reflect on how health data science had been reflected in JAMIA since its inception. And so the pink term at the top is the total number of publications in the journal. And I picked what I saw as just some keyword terms, and we'll see them a little more clearly shortly. But what you can see in general from this first slide is like currently about 25% of our pages are devoted to papers that would fall under terms frequently used in data science, such as machine learning, deep learning, neural network, predictive models, et cetera. And you can see it a little more clearly on this particular slide. I note that the top blue line, which is even higher than the green machine learning line, is actually electronic health records. But one of the things that has, and at our recent editorial board meeting, I said, we are not the Journal of Electronic Health Records. When I look at this slide, it looks like we could be. But in fact, what you see, what you really see over time is that much of what we published is about, has a key term of electronic health records because it's electronic health record data as a source for data science rather than this is how you build or use an EHR. I wanted to just, one of the things I was kind of asked last night was, you know, kind of what is your path to being an editor, and what does an editor do? Well, one of the things that, of course, an editor has responsibility for the content in a journal and the responsibility for managing that peer review process. But I think very importantly, what's fun about being an editor is being able to contextualize that content in a way that you hope is meaningful to the readership or the readership you'd like to have for your journal. So I thought I'd just share through the years a little bit about some of the editorials done by some different editors. And so I start with this first one, which was in 2013. And those of you in health or biomedicine will remember this is the time of the NIH BD2K initiative. So the former editor of JAMIA made this contention that data science and biomedical informatics were the same thing. And although data scientists might imply a significant difference between those who handle data versus those who handle information, she's arguing that in the field of biomedicine, healthcare, and health behavior data, there's no distinction. They are the same thing. So that was 2013. A second editorial, also by Dr. Ono Machado, just pointed out the ubiquity of things that would fall into data science that are occurring in every single issue of JAMIA. The first, in 2019, there was the first focus issue in JAMIA on data science. It was led by Patty Brennan, as I said, director of the National Library of Medicine, Michael Chiang, who is currently the director of the Eye Institute at the NIH, and then Lucila. And so we see a little bit of people saying, well, maybe these are overlapping fields. Maybe we don't do all the same things, but we do some of the same things. And these are specifically some things that they pulled out as shared, like data-driven discovery, reproducibility, but that in biomedical informatics, there might be more focus on knowledge representation, clinical information understanding, and then you see some things specifically called out for biomedical data science. And I'm just doing this to kind of show you how the history of the terms changed. When, as I was reflecting in my first years being an editor-in-chief, I thought, gosh, you know, when I was at Stanford, I certainly learned about neural networks. It was a very different time in 1991 in terms of data sources and computational power. But I'd learned something. I learned something from that, and so this was my question: is this new or not new? But certainly, there's a lot that the fundamental principles and values that have shared. But clearly, the increased computational power and the variety of data types have certainly ushered it into a very important era. And I am very hopeful that this is going to advance discovery, improve healthcare and health equity. So now I'd like to turn to some of the things that I'm thinking about, and particularly when thinking about it from the perspective of JMIA and what belongs in JMIA. From my perspective, and this was my selling point in my interview, is I said it was very important that JMIA, as the journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, that we really focused on consequential health issues. And Sandro Galea, who maybe public health and physicians might be aware of, a very important thought leader and epidemiologist, and he had really ushered in an area of consequential epidemiology. And so what that means from the perspective of, and if there's any philosophers in the room, forgive me, but what that in general means from the perspective of philosophy of science is that it's very important not to just think about the methods and incremental improvement in methods, but really to make sure that you're focusing on an important healthcare problem. And so when I look at the current literature on ethical AI and ethical machine learning, this certainly does come out. And this was 2018, and I put down some things that I thought would be important, including thinking about social determinants of health, and just saying we really want to be clear about the so what questions. So when you might not have noticed, but we actually, I would say, and I wish I had the exact number, we publish a relatively small number of predictive models compared to the volume of submissions we get. And one of the reasons that papers get rejected is they're not dealing with a consequential problem. They're dealing with a very narrow, very small problem. And so I pointed out and you'll see a number of slides in this way. I said one of the things I think I'm going to be doing today is to be introducing some groups of Michigan people to other groups of Michigan people. And I'm just pointing out is indeed authors from the University of Michigan. And it was a quick count, I was able to pull up at least 125 papers, have really focused on some incredibly important consequential health problems, thinking about the contributions of these group papers on COVID-19 in terms of really coming up with a severity phenotype, which Gil participated in, and then also looking at this paper that Chuck Friedman was part of, and then other important issues around prescriptions, and also thinking about it from the important problem of health literacy, health numeracy, which is quite limited in the U.S., even among native English speakers, and thinking of the important work that Brian Zygmunt Fisher does in this particular area. So I consider these to be consequential health problems. I've tried to be tuned in to the important problems of our time, and I think it was maybe in 2021, we were a bunch of journal editors, probably including some in this room, had the opportunity to publish the COP26 editorial, and I chose to do there. And at that point, I not only published that editorial, but I said, we will do something in JAMIA related to climate change. So our current issue of this year of 22, our December issue, focuses on specifically on climate change. And we also are publishing in that issue the COP27 editorial from African editors, and related in advance of the COP27 meeting. And this is important because it's really focusing on the fact that low and middle income countries are bearing the burden of climate change when they are contributing less to it. And so this wonderful editorial, along with about 8 papers in this issue, focus on a call to arms for health informatics and what can we do to avoid climate disaster. Another way to think about consequential, I guess, is what are people citing from JAMIA? And as you can see, virtually everything that's getting well cited is actually papers focused on some aspect of COVID-19, with a little deep learning and natural language processing thrown in there, but for the most part, all about the problem and less about the methods. And many of these papers did have to do with really explicated a lot of the COVID-19 health disparities as well. The other thing that we really think about, and this would be an area where this group would certainly excel, is certainly the notion of methodological innovation. So one of the reasons that that predictive analytics papers frequently do get rejected is the lack of methodological innovation. So maybe someone will have a reasonable problem, but they'll just kind of apply the SciPy, machine learning kit without any sense to which type of model might best fit the data. And so there'll simply be a lack of innovation methodologically. And so one of the things that's changed over time, and one of my associate editors, Les Leonard from Medical University of South Carolina, was nice enough to let me nag him into writing this particular paper, just about the science of informatics and predictive analytics. And this is one I quote in my rejection letters frequently, and just saying the use of EHR data alone does not constitute innovation. Use of standard machine learning packages does not constitute innovation. And then really turning us towards things, and in a journal such as JAMIA, to be thinking about when are models likely to yield benefits, and also how to maintain models in a sustainable way over time in practice. And I pulled out, just once again highlighting your University of Michigan authors that have demonstrated a high level of innovation. These are a few of the papers I picked out that show either analytical or data source innovation, new type of approaches, very useful to the community. And so thank you for sending them to JAMIA. I really appreciate it. One of the ways that we also try to drive some methodological innovation is to do focus issues. And these are most typically proposed by someone external, frequently an editorial board member, or it could be simply someone else that has some experience with the journal. But one of the things that we try to do in these types of things, which we have a set of usually guest associate editors, they have a particular topic, and then there's a call for papers. So just showing some of the different aspects that we've looked at through the last couple of years in terms of methods. And one of the things we were trying to get at in that informatics for sex and gender related focus issue was the NIH puts a lot of attention on sex as a biological variable. And so what are ways that we deal with that? But there are other instances, of course, when it's important that we're really addressing gender-related health rather than sex as a biological variable. In addition to a methodological innovation, we want methodological rigor. And I'm just sharing, this slide, which comes from Liu et al. And as far as I can tell, this is still a medRxiv paper from 2021. And this was in the area of clinical prediction models, just looking at the full range of reporting guidelines we have so far, and looking at, of these different reporting guidelines, you can really see that the majority of reporting guidelines really focus on model development. Some guidelines related 10% of model development on model fairness. And then when we look at the pink areas, we see actually limited guidance for things around how do you get it deployed into the design of a system, how is it executed in the workflow, how is it monitored, what's the prospective evaluation. I will note, and I forget where it is, I think it's in, there's a follow-on 2022 paper by the same author. Liu is the first author, I think, and Nigam Shah is the senior author, that has applied this same type of approach to look at a set of algorithms that are in the EPIC electronic health record, and looked at the extent to which they meet the guidelines. And that is in, I think, JAMA Network. But it's a very interesting paper. I'm calling out once again your Michigan authors on areas of different types of areas of methodological rigor, thinking about standardization of things such as protocols, thinking about assessing the value of longitudinal observations, thinking about Chuck Friedman and others who had the systematic review that was looking at what was measured in clinical decision support studies, and then thinking also about the pre-processing, data-driven pre-processing pipeline for structured clinical data, because I think it's important that we have rigor in all aspects in it. When we look at it, I wanted to point out that people do, in general, I would say in biomedical informatics, some of the general conversation will be that if you're going to do a methods paper, maybe the Journal of Biomedical Informatics is a great place for that, and maybe JAMIA is not as good of a place to it. And JBI does allow for longer papers, so it is a good avenue for dissemination, and our impact factors are almost exactly the same. We're like 7.942, and they're 8.0, so that doesn't make the difference. But I wanted to point out, in fact, that some of the methodological papers are among the most viewed of the journal. These are the top 10, and I particularly was noting the one that's getting a lot of attention near the bottom, which is from this year is the one that's on the harm of class imbalance corrections and risk prediction models. So, and that's actually beginning to get cited quite a bit. So just showing you a little bit about how I guess the readership is seeing this content from their perspective. And of course, the importance of transparency and reproducibility. You have a whole center on that here, so I don't think I can say too much. I'm just delighted to hear that there is such a center, because it's foundational to impact, and there are a number of different types of guidelines to help to ensure that. I point out just the Minimar, which we did publish in JAMIA. I'm now going to turn to the last topic, which is putting some attention to equity and bias mitigation. And this is a topic that I am, it will be clear, I'm incredibly passionate about this particular topic. And it is one of the things that I have put more attention to in the journal as a whole. During the time when I knew I was going to be the editor-in-chief, but Tiffany Vayneau and Jessica Anker didn't yet know, they approached me in my associate editor role to think about a JAMIA issue focused on health informatics and health equity. And so we absolutely went through it, and in fact, we had so many submissions that it was a double issue. And I think over half the authors had not published in JAMIA before, but this was very important. One of the things was really thinking about what was the differences between how many papers were focused on detecting disparities, only one paper really focusing on understanding why disparities exist, and then about half were intervention studies. And of course, you can talk more to Tiffany about this. But this is based on a fabulous paper called, this framework is based on a fabulous paper that Tiffany led that was about leveling up, and took the WHO social determinants of health framework and really informaticized it to talk about really moving the interventions to upstream. So we're not only focusing on preventing that unequal consequences of health, but we're also focusing on things such as reducing exposures and decreasing vulnerability. And they identified some key areas for future work: more theory-informed evaluation of equity impacts of all interventions. As I mentioned, the novel upstream interventions, thinking about what more measurement we need. And then also just highlighting something that's so important in health data science, but where people who do health equity research are so hopeful, is that with these larger data sets, we will be able to do more subgroup analyses that are not possible with many current data sets, to really understand things at a scale that's not previously been possible. So we have, these are some examples of some additional Michigan papers focused on different aspects of health equity, looking at transgender mental health disparities, a perspective on that. Michael McKee and others on promoting health equity for persons with who are deaf through the electronic health record. Michael and I worked together on the National Academy's Health Literacy Roundtable, and I was delighted to get this paper from him. And then a paper by Vayneau and others that focused on the idea that good intentions are not enough, how informatics interventions can worsen inequality, and really thinking about how we have to be very careful to ensure that that doesn't happen along the way. So there have been kind of some disruptive things, I'd say, in the journal world during my period of time as editor, which started in January 2019. think it was in, I think this was in 2021, where there was this health affairs blog, which ended up being quite influential. And it was specifically related to race and racism, and really called for adopting rigorous standards for publishing on racial health equities. And really doing away with the notion that race was a biological variable, and calling for journals to revisit their editorial and publication guidelines to make sure there was alignment with evolving definitions of race and socio-political structures. And this was in, no, it might have been 2020, but anyway, it was a period of time where we were publishing lots of papers related to telehealth, many of which included, many of which identified different types of racial disparities. So we did take this very seriously at the journals, and I sent a few papers back to some authors and just said, we really need you to expand your discussion. You're treating race as an attribute of a person, not as a lived experience. And we just need a more nuanced discussion if we're going to move forward in this racism. And the authors I approached were very competent to do it. One of them broke my heart a little and said, well, we know a lot about this. We just didn't think an informatics journal would care about this. And I said, no, indeed we care. We've got some skin in this game as well, and we want to move forward with that. So learning along the way, and I just refer you to many of the publication style guides, including AMA have new standards for collecting and reporting race and ethnicity. And one of the things that I think ends up being very important to people who are using existing data sets is how we deal with these groups labeled as others. And what these guidelines are really saying, analytically, it may make sense to have an other category, but descriptively, at least, we should be teasing out the collective so we know who was clumped into the terms. And they also make guidelines around listing things in text, and particularly in tables and in figures, really thinking about alphabetical order. And so I felt we were making pretty good progress in thinking about this. We got an invitation on behalf of the AMIA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion task force at that time, of which I was a member, to do a panel at the AMIA's Informatics Summit on health equity. Tiffany Vano participated in it, another of other people, and one of the authors of this paper, which is an incredibly well-intentioned paper that used National Science Foundation data to really show that indeed from 2002 to 2017, we are not making much progress in trends and academic placement. What I learned through audience comments in the chat, this is over Zoom, audience comments in the chat and calls to member services and leadership afterwards, that some consider underrepresented minority to be a harmful and racist language. And so I'm sharing my learning. And I thought, well, why is that? One of the reasons is it denies groups the right to name themselves. So that's a little bit also around the other. So we have the right to name ourselves. And it also, with that collective, it also blinds us to differences in the circumstances and the lived experiences of people that are in that clump. And in some people believe that it's a racist language because it implies kind of a master-slave relationship between the majority, who are the overrepresented majority, and the underrepresented minorities. So I'm just saying, language matters. We've had a rough few years in particular, and I think we all just need to learn. Well, this, in terms of organizational response, one of the things that happened over the course of time was AMIA's DEI task force became a committee, and they started a group on inclusive language that's ongoing, and I was recently part of the group talking about this. So the negative reaction to the this one paper in the JMIA panel inspired an organizational response, which made sense. And there's a lot of literature now out there on inclusive language, but this task force within AMIA is focusing on really thinking about inclusive language from the perspective of the type of research that we publish in JMIA and the type of things that a variety of members do in their work. And so the guidelines aren't there yet, but they really are focused on 4 general principles. One is plurality, which has to do with maybe, once again, allowing individuals to really name themselves. And so it might be the variety of words that might relate to someone who might describe themselves as non-binary. If they come from an indigenous population, they might consider themselves to be two-spirit, and being able to use those words. Precision really has to do with naming the people in the collective. So that ends up being important when we think about what data sources we're using. And also transparency. A lot of times when we're using existing data, we are limited to whatever, and we're not necessarily collecting. We're really limited to how that data was collected, what choices were possible. So just the call is to really be more transparent about that. And just if there's anyone in here who works in healthcare standards or is particularly interested in social determinants of health, the U.S. has the U.S. core data set for interoperability, and a core area that's being worked out at the moment for inclusion in that core data set is social determinants of health. And the project is called Gravity, so if anyone is particularly interested in that, I encourage them to get involved with the volunteer effort called Gravity to really inform that, so that these core data sets inform the terminologies that are used in things such as electronic health records and other data sources that someone who is a data scientist might want to mine. And the last thing I want to mention is there certainly is the whole area of mitigation of bias. And there certainly are, from my perspective, a number of frameworks. I don't feel, as of yet, there are a sufficient number of tools to help informatics researchers handle the bias. How do they mitigate the bias? And also, I don't think we have a good handle on what really we should be looking at from the perspective of reporting guidelines. So I'm really hoping, I've been plugging like focus issues, I'd like to see something out of this community that could be a focus issue in JMIA that really would focus on bias mitigation. Happy to talk to you later about that. And then lastly, I want to just plug a couple of our open focus issue calls for papers. One is specifically focused on social determinants of health extraction through natural language processing, and that has a very near-term deadline of December 5th. And then visualization of health data for lay audience. And I'm really hoping that there will be different types of submissions from this community such as yours today, because of course there can be things related to the kind of research that I do, but in another project that I'm involved with, a subcommittee for the NIH director, that's focused on next generation technologies. We've been doing some community conversations and doing listening with community members and gathering perceptions on, so an algorithm has been used. How do you want to find out about it? What are you going to understand about it? And I really think that we need that last step that Patty Brennan and I talked about in that 2015 paper, is really you get this output that might come from a predictive model or another type of algorithm. How would you visualize that in a way to help a lay audience? And by that, we are really talking in this specific call for patients, research participants, community members. I think with some things algorithmic, there are certain ways that clinicians are kind of a lay audience as well, because they, of course, they have the scientific knowledge, but they may not have some of the understanding. So I encourage your participation and look forward to seeing submissions from this August group to these two call for papers. And so now I have some time for questions and discussion. So thank you so much for your time.
Perfect. You guys can hear me? Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Bakken, for that talk. While folks are thinking about their questions, just raise your hand, or I think you can come up to one of the, we have a mic stand here and a mic stand over there. I'll get us started with a question. You mentioned that in data science, we should focus on what matters. And so I think particularly when you're a methodologist, when you're excited about, understanding how a methodology might be applied in a bunch of different areas, how do we figure out what matters? Is it interdisciplinary collaboration? Is it engaging the public and our communities? How do we do that?
Yeah, you've already kind of answered. I think it is data science is, no doubt, it's a team sport. It's an interdisciplinary sport. And we really need, my call to the methodologist in the room is, really create some methodologies that we can apply to address the important consequential issues. But I think it's really important to have that interaction and that feedback early on, rather to kind of add it later. And so I think from the beginning, having that that engagement.
Go ahead here. I'll hand you my mic just so that you don't have to try to figure out how to get out.
Thanks a lot. Hi. David Corliss. I wrote a column for Amstat News on Data for Good. One of the things you mentioned, one of the ideas I've been promoting lately, and I was really, really glad to see represented in your talk, is the idea of critical race theory as a statistical practice, an informatics practice, just as much as a legal theory and a historical line of investigation. The one aspect of critical race theory I saw in your presentation I want to ask a little bit more about. A lot of dimensions of critical race theory. One of the things we find when we study critical race theory is that some of the interventions have actually made things worse. And you had that in one of your, I was just delighted to see that. That's one of the fundamental points.
You can thank Tiffany Vayneau and Jessica Anker for that.
Thank you very much. I was really, really glad to see that. That's one of the really important things that CRT people are looking at. Are you seeing more of this? I haven't seen it yet outside of statistics and sociological journals. Can you tell us more about that? How sometimes the interventions we do can actually make equity less, or there's less equity?
Well, I think there are a number of different ways, and one of the things that computational power allows us just to really do it big time at scale. And I think some of the things I feel a lack of true understanding of what it is that we're dealing with. So I think so much of what we do is from it's from a single data source, and we haven't more fully contextualized, and so it's very exciting. I know Jenna Weens had presented to this NIH committee I was on, and she talked about, you know, multimodal data sets and machine learning over those, and so I'm really hopeful if we can get a more contextualized version that we may have a more nuanced understanding, and then of just the phenomenon that we're dealing with. And then also, many interventions aren't multi-level, and what that health equity double issue would say, like much of what is being done is either focused at the individual behavior, possibly putting weight on individuals who are already burdened, or it's on the health system, but it's not so much on the community or the health policy types of things. So we really need more in the way of, I think, these multi-level interventions that take full advantage of like a socio-ecological approach, and yeah, and also just more just in the things that I do, everything is community engaged, and and most typically I'm not a member of the communities that I'm studying, but I am working, but my research team is, to make sure we are getting that authentic engagement, which adds to us really understanding and gives us new ideas of more interventions for both discoveries and interventions.
I think we have time for one more question. I guess I'll ask it, since I don't see any hands up, no brave volunteers. You talked a lot about overlap between data science and informatics. What's different about informatics? Like, you know, if you were drawing this as a Venn diagram, what is the informatics part that's not data science?
Yeah, so the things that I think about are maybe current lines, which I don't think, some of those divisions I don't think that should be there, but I think we, in many aspects of informatics, we spend a lot of time on user-centered design, and so we think about that from the perspective of who's going to be, not just what's going to be computed and displayed, but who is the person that's going to be using it. And so we're not necessarily only focused on, in some instances, for example, you might be visualizing, but you're visualizing for a highly literate audience with scientific knowledge, which is very different than thinking about another type of user. But I think, although that's a current distinction, I think as people talk about more human in the loop system, I think both on the input and the output and the different cycles in between, for me, I'm not saying that these things are so different. I just know in our training program we may emphasize some different things. And if I am introducing myself, I would never call myself a data scientist. And so when I introduce myself, I say I'm a nurse scientist, I'm a biomedical informatician. That doesn't mean that I don't belong to a data science institute. I do. My students learn data science because I bring in people that can teach them the analytical techniques that are beyond what I learned in my very old training. But I don't think it's necessarily important to, I don't think it's important to make the distinctions from my perspective. I just think there are some things that that can be either completely non-overlapping or maybe just in kind of a different dose, depending on whether your training is situated in health versus it's situated in computer science versus situated in biostatistics. But we all bring something to it, and that's why we need to work together.
Thank you, Dr. Bakken. Let's give Dr. Bakken a round of applause.